Donald Byron Thomas is the author of a new book, Hear No Evil, Acoustic Evidence in Dealey Plaza. He published an article in the International Journal of Science and Justice in 2001, which reignited the debate on the acoustics evidence in the Kennedy assassination, called Study Back's Theory of Grassy Knoll. New report says second gunman fired at Kennedy, wrote the Washington Post. Thomas refuted those who had claimed to debunk the work of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, whose acoustic scientists found that a shot indeed did come from the grassy knoll. His new book, Hear No Evil, Social Constructivism and the Forensic Evidence in the Kennedy Assassination, is a detailed walkthrough of the major scientific evidence in the Kennedy murder. Thomas is a government scientist. He received a PhD from the University of Missouri. He's authored or co-authored several books and more than 100 articles in the scientific journals, and he's currently president of the Coleopterist Society, and he serves as associate editor for the Annals of the Entomological Society of America. You'll have to ask him what those things mean, but I never met a coleopterist.
The vine's working out.
Okay, thank you. So this is Don Thomas. Thanks.
Thank you, John. So I'm hoping our difficulties will not extend through my talk, because if the sound doesn't work, then...
There's getting better sound now because
Yeah.
it's close to us.
Okay. All right, we'll go ahead and key up the PowerPoint, and we'll... Now, is there a pointer?
Carl has a pointer. Carl, can you borrow yours?
Can I control the...
Just ask him to make this one.
Okay, well, he's going to have to... Okay.
Can people see all right up here? Do I feel like I have to dim the lights more?
Okay. Okay, well, thank you, John. In 1978, the House Select Committee on Assassinations heard testimony from acoustical experts that the gunshots that killed President Kennedy had been recorded over a police radio system, and that it included a gunshot from the grassy knoll. Ever since then, the acoustical evidence has been under challenge, under assault, and in my lecture today I'm going to talk about some of those challenges and demonstrate for you that under the principle that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, that those challenges fail and that the acoustical evidence is stronger than ever. Next slide. On the time that President Kennedy was assassinated, the Dallas police were broadcasting over two separate channels. The channel one was the primary police channel for routine broadcast. It was being recorded on a dictaphone machine. This is the channel that actually has the alleged putative gunshots. A second channel was an auxiliary channel which they used for special occasions, and on this day it was dedicated to the President's motorcade. So this was being recorded on an autographed disc recorder like this here, and it is by the context of those broadcasts that we can actually pinpoint the time of the assassination. Next slide. Okay, there's supposed to be like an icon there. If you can click on that icon. Okay. Okay, there's a sound bite in there, and it should say Stemmons. Can you play that?
This can be really hard to do without messing up the, have to shut the display off.
Okay, can you? Let's do that. Apparently there's a incompatibility between the Apple and the IBM. I'm an IBM, yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, at the time of the assassination, the Channel 1 broadcast was dominated by the sound of a motorcycle motor. Somewhere in Dallas, the microphone on a motorcycle cop's microphone, his radio, was stuck in the on position. So he was effectively jamming the Channel 1 broadcast. As a consequence, the Channel 2 dispatcher put out a broadcast, which I'm trying to play for you now.
I'm sorry. Want that again?
Sure, one more time. Cool. Okay, can we go back to the PowerPoint then? Well, the point of that recording is you heard the dispatcher say that there's a motorcycle up on Stemmons. And so the question was, what made that dispatcher so certain that the motorcycle was on the Stemmons freeway? Well, the clue, the major clue, was the fact that in the background he could hear sirens. And the one emergency that was happening at that moment was the President's motorcade was on its way to on Stemmons freeway to Parkland Hospital. The dispatcher also knew that there were 18 motorcycles escorting the President, so it was a quick deduction that he made that it must be one of those motorcycles with the motorcade and therefore on Stemmons freeway. And of course, since the open microphone was open from 12:28 to 12:33 and the assassination was between 12:30 and 12:31, then it's logical to assume that it would have been in Dealey Plaza and therefore the microphone would have picked up the sounds of the gunfire. On that basis, the House Select Committee on Assassinations hired a consultant firm to analyze the recording to see if they could find the gunshots. The police radio system was a voice grade system, which means it was designed to enhance and to amplify frequencies in the range of a human voice. Had it been a high fidelity system, you could have heard the gunshots. Since it was a voice grade system, that meant they were going to have to hire acoustical experts to look for the residue, to look for the signals that might have been distorted that could have been gunfire. The Congress, the House Select Committee, went to the Acoustical Society of America and asked for a recommendation, and the Acoustical Society recommended the firm of Bolt, Baranek, and Newman, now called BBN Technologies, to perform the analysis. This was the same firm that did the Watergate tapes. More importantly, more relevantly, they had also done the Kent State shooting. Most recently, this is the laboratory that developed the boomerang anti-sniper device, which is used in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's basically an array of microphones hooked to a microprocessor with a GPS system that will instantly tell from incoming fire exactly where the sniper is. I understand that the Al-Qaeda in Iraq call it the octopus of death. They've learned not to shoot at guys that have that array on there. The same scientific team, led by James Barger, that did the Kennedy assassination, also developed the boomerang device and had also done the Kent State shooting. I mention that because you can find websites that argue that the acoustics experts were incompetent and didn't really know how to look for gunfire on a recording. Well, anyway, Bolt, Baranek, and Newman, led by James Barger, the lead scientist, analyzed the dicta belt and located about 2 minutes into the recording, they found a cluster of sounds which had the acoustical characteristics that they were looking for. And the problem was that there was not just the three sounds, the three shots that the Warren Commission had argued for, but rather they found 5. So they went to the next step, to Dealey Plaza, and fired test shots in the summer of 1978, recorded those test shots from the grassy knoll and from the book depository, and compared those patterns to the patterns that were on the Dallas police tape, and found that they indeed matched, and all 5 matched the test shots fired in Dealey Plaza. Okay. The next slide I want to talk from, I really can't go a cappella. I mean, I'm going to have this slide up. So.
That's the best I can do for you.
That's the best you can do? Okay. This is a plot showing the microphone array that they placed 36 microphones in along the motorcade route. The idea here is that if their matches that they achieved to the test shots in Dealey Plaza were just spurious for some reason, bad luck, they happened to match. If these patterns had nothing on the tape, have nothing to do, the matching was based on echolocation, so it has to do with the arrangement of the structures where the echoes would come from in Dealey Plaza. So if these matches have nothing to do with that, then it was pure luck, then there was likely to get a match at any given microphone location. And if you got multiple matches, then they would be in some sort of random order. Well, the first sound on the police tape matched to a test shot that was recorded at a microphone here on Houston Street, about 20 feet from the intersection. Now, if it's a random match, of course, it could have occurred anywhere. This is where it happened to match. But the second sound on the police tape matched to the next microphone, which was at the intersection of Elm and Houston. The third sound matched at this microphone on Elm Street near the intersection, and so on. The fourth matched to a microphone here, and the fifth sound matched here. In other words, they went in order. There's a sequence of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which is the only sequence it could be if it was really on a motorcycle traveling with the motorcade. There's 125 ways that you can scramble 5 numbers, only one of which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this is, right off, shows you there's one chance in 125, but these aren't really the gunshots that killed Kennedy. But it's not just the sequence, it's the spacing. Because on the police tape, the first 3 shots occur about a second apart, and then the second ones occur 5 seconds later. And you can see the same thing. You get 3 microphones in a row, then you skip 4 microphones, and then 2 microphones in a row further down on Houston Street. So the topographic spacing exactly matched the temporal spacing on the police tape. And it's not just the sequence and the spacing, it's the trajectory, because the distance from this first microphone to the 5th microphone was 130 feet. And the spacing from the first sound to the last sound on the tape is 8.3 seconds. In order to go 130 feet in 8.3 seconds, that translates to a speed of 11.5 miles per hour. And back in 1963, the FBI, using the Spruder film, showed the motorcade was moving 11.3 miles per hour. So you have a precise agreement with the arrangement of the sound matching to the possibility that it was a motorcade with a motorcycle with his microphone open. It was this order in the data that convinced the acoustical experts that they had found that their matches were valid and they had found the gunshots killed President Kennedy. I've yet to see anyone argue against this evidence, argue about that order in the data. Okay, next slide. Okay, so if you had been in Dealey Plaza that day, and if the acoustical evidence is correct, this is the sequence of gunfire that you would have heard. Next slide. This one is the grassy knoll shot, the fourth one here. Now, the obvious thing you would do is let's compare our audio to our video. The Zapruder film shows two places where someone is actually shot, actually wounded. The headshot is quite obvious at Zapruder frame 313. We also see Governor Conley, he buckles over and he collapses. Now the Warren Commission said, well, it must be a delayed reaction because it didn't jive with other evidence they had of the sequence of shooting. But then a company called Failure Analysis Associates, who was hired by the American Bar Association, analyzed the Zapruder film and found the evidence that he was actually shot at frame 224. That's when we see his lapel flap. And of course, there was other evidence. This happens just before he buckles over, and now there's other evidence to confirm that that shot is at frame 224. Next slide. The video sequence is also 4.8 seconds between when Conley gets shot and President Kennedy gets shot. So we have a coordination between the audio and the video. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, the other thing that you would look for is to see if you can find the motorcycle and if it was in the locations predicted by the acoustical evidence. This is a picture taken from the Robert Hughes film, and it shows a motorcycle officer rounding the corner of Main in Houston. This is Officer McLean, and to set this up for you, the first shot, remember, was recorded at a microphone here at the other end of the street, right about here. So he's got about 160 feet to go. He's about 160 feet away from the position at this point. At a speed of 10 miles per hour, that's the equivalent of 15 feet per second. So he would need about 10 seconds to get there if he was going 10 miles per hour. He would get there in 5 seconds if he was going 20 miles per hour. He's actually going 15 miles per hour as he makes the turn here. Hughes himself wrote in a letter to his parents that he heard the first shot about 5 seconds after he stopped filming. And this is about 1 second before he stops filming. So it would appear that McLean is in the right place. So they interviewed him. House Select Committee interviewed him. In his interview, he said, yeah, his microphone used to stick on in the open position on him all the time. Next slide. This is a slide taken after the assassination. We have no pictures that show McLean in between these two events. This was about 15 seconds after the shooting, and this one slide shows all 4 motorcycles that were in the midsection of the motorcade. McLean is over here. This is Corson. This is Haygood. And over here is Baker's motorcycle. Baker, of course, the one who went up and found Lee Harvey Oswald red-handed buying a Coke in the book depository. Next slide. This was taken about 5 seconds later. This is McLean. This is Corson. You can see Corson is actually catching up to him now. McLean was going rather slow. He was cruising. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, so this sets up basically a hypothesis. This is a scenario based on those slides that I showed you, plus where the map of where the matching microphones were. These are the matching microphones. This is where we saw McLean before the shooting. This is where we saw McLean after the shooting. The sound of the motor is higher at first, about a second and a half before the first gunshot. He slows down, so we think he slowed for the intersection, and then he remained at idle for about the next 20 seconds or so. So this is a hypothesis that we can test. Okay, next slide. Okay, this was challenged by a television program, ABC News, in 2004, put out this documentary called Beyond Conspiracy. They got a fellow named Dale Myers, who had done an analysis of where the microphone might have been of the films taken in Dealey Plaza at the time. Next slide. Okay. In the program, Myers argued that this picture was taken of McLean only 1/2 second before the first shot. And if so, that would require a speed of approximately 200 miles per hour for the motorcycle cop to get to the required location. In the program, of course, they don't show any details. There was no way to know how he'd come by this calculation. A group of us got together and tried to duplicate what Myers had done. We were unable to do so. It wasn't until 2008 that Myers then put up his analysis on his website so we could actually see where he had gone wrong. Next slide. There's no actual tie point between the Zapruder film and the Hughes film. So what you have to go by is the position of the cars on Houston Street. For just a brief about 2 seconds in the Zapruder film, you can see the cars that are on Houston Street. They're further to the north than they are in the Hughes film. So what you'd have to do is an extrapolation to say, okay, here's where they are in the Zapruder film, here's where they are in the Hughes film, now let's add a speed to those cars, and that will give us the separation in time. Well, it's easy to do a line of sight in the Zapruder film because the cars are moving perpendicular to the view of the camera. You've got the structures in Dealey Plaza. You can plot those on a map. And, of course, you can also plot their speed, how fast they take them to go from point A to point B. The cars, for example, the 8th car in the motorcade was going about 9 miles per hour. The 5th car in the motorcade was only going about 6.5 miles per hour. So there's a little bit seemed like a little kind of a surge in slow as they went. Next slide. This is simple, how you do a line of sight. You know where Zapruder is, you know where the cars are because of the structures, and so you can figure out exactly, plot on a map where the cars are. Next slide. The problem with doing that with a Hughes film is because, first of all, we don't know where Hughes was. We have searched the films. We know he was in this area because of his point of view, but we're unable to pinpoint which guy here was actually Hughes. So that was one of our questions, was how the heck did Myers figure out for his point of view? In fact, Myers claimed that he did something called an epipolar analysis. He couldn't have done an epipolar analysis. An epipolar analysis is when you have two cameras both showing an object, and each camera shows the other camera. You can see it in that camera. But nowhere in the Zapruder film can you see Hughes, and nowhere in Hughes's film can you see Zapruder. And those are your epipoles. You use those as a baseline to do a triangulation. So he couldn't have done an epipole. So he seems to have claimed to have done a high-tech analysis, which he couldn't have done. He must have done just a simple point of view, but we don't know how he could do a point of view if you don't know where Hughes is. Next slide. And the way, of course, the other problem is the cars are moving away from you instead of perpendicular to your view, and it's kind of a disappearing point. So how the heck do you do a point of view in this situation, especially if you don't even know where the guy was? Well, we tried to figure out where Hughes was by looking at his point of view. You can see he's pointing his camera straight in line with the grease that was in the outer lane of traffic here. At another point, when he was aiming down Main Street, he was in line with the outer traffic stripe. So you just draw your cross lines, and this is a study by Paul Seaton. This is where he figured this is where Hughes was. Okay, next slide. Well, when we see Myers puts out his analysis, he's moved him so that he's closer to the other line, the inner line. He doesn't explain how he found him there, but that's where he places him for his analysis. That's 11 foot closer to the north, which means that if he did everything else right, if he did his point of view right, then he's going to have the cars 11 feet, about a half a car length further to the north, closer to where the Zapruder filmed them, which is the cars are moving at essentially 2 seconds to go 1 car length, 11 feet being half a car length, so he lops a second. He gains 1 second by fudging the position of where Hughes was. Next slide. The other thing he did, remember I mentioned that depending on which car you used, car 8 was moving 9 miles per hour, car number 5 was going only 6.5 miles per hour. Well, naturally, he selected 9 miles per hour, and in his model, his cartoon, he has all the cars moving like cars in a train, moving at the same speed, and by using 9 miles per hour, essentially he lops another half a second off the timeline. So now we're up to, actually, instead of a half a second, we're up to 2 seconds, which translates to 50 miles per hour rather than 200 miles per hour. But this wasn't the biggest error that he made. Next slide. If you use the coordinate that I showed you so that the grassy knoll shot matches to the head shot, that places the first gunshot at frame 175 of the Zapruder film. But Myers didn't like the idea that he could have been killed from the grassy knoll, so he used a synchronization based on a shot from the book depository. And so what that does is that moves the time up to frame 160 is where he placed the first shot. Again, he lops another second off of our timeline. So if you use 3 seconds instead of a half a second, which is 6 times longer, now the motorcycle only has to go 30 miles per hour. So we're back into you cannot use the Hughes film to prove that the acoustical evidence is wrong. In fact, the police officers that were in the motorcade said on Houston Street it was actually a stop and go, not even a surge and go, and of course we can't prove them wrong. However, so the upshot of the Hughes film, it doesn't prove one way or the other. But he missed a major point because he didn't do the right synchronization. At frame 175, this is the 5th car in the motorcade. The motorcycle would have been in this neighborhood here, which means it would have been next to the 6th car, near the mayor's car. Next slide. The mayor's car does appear in the Dorman film. Okay. Now, Dorman film 2 was a discontinuous film. She filmed the sequence first showing the president's limousine, then she panned back to as far as the 5th car in the motorcade, and she stopped filming. Her next sequence, she begins here. Now we get the 6th car in the motorcade, the mayor's car, and then she filmed backwards. Next slide. To set that up then, this is Dorman's point of view. This is the lamp, the signal light. Here's where the mayor's car would have been. From that plat that I showed you, that hypothesis of where the motorcycle should be by second, it predicts, because we can connect this to the Zapruder film. This was taken a half second before the headshot, and at that time, the motorcycle would have been right there. In other words, right between the 5th car and the 6th car. Exasperatingly, the one place in the Dorman film that we can't actually see is exactly where the acoustical evidence predicts the motorcycle to be. Next slide. Now, Dorman pans to her left, and 6 seconds later, she picks up a motorcycle at the intersection. Of course, Myers instantly says, well, there's McLean. He's out of position. But how do we know that that's McLean? How do we know that that's not Corson? Because of the next slide. Yeah, next slide. Yeah. This event here, Mrs. Kennedy climbed out onto the trunk of the car, and she was there for just 3 seconds, about 3 to 6 seconds after the fatal shot. McLean, in his memoir, says that when he rounded the intersection, he looked down the street and he saw Mrs. Kennedy on the trunk of the car. So the picture in Dorman is coordinate with McLean's memory of what he saw. That suggests that it's Corson. Now, McLean, on the other hand, McLean said, yeah, he remembers seeing Mrs. Kennedy on the trunk of the car. He also claimed at one point that he had stopped on Houston Street. This proves that didn't happen. Either that's McLean or it's Corson. And if it's McLean, he didn't stop. And if it's Corson, he's in front of Corson. So McLean, if that's Corson, next slide. and they both saw that, they have to both be on Houston Street, both on Elm Street, and that's Corson, not McLean. In which case, the only place McLean could be, and we don't have a picture proving it, what we have is by process of elimination, the only place he could be is exactly where the acoustical evidence predicts it. So the filmed evidence is coordinate, contrary to this program, with the acoustical evidence. Next slide. The biggest challenge to the acoustical evidence came from the National Research Council, and the program, the research was led by Luis Alvarez. Of course, Luis Alvarez was not a completely indifferent researcher in this case because he had published several papers on the Kennedy assassination, including Alvarez was the one that came up with the idea that it was jet propulsion that caused President Kennedy's head to go backwards when he was struck in the head. Next slide. Perhaps the most notorious study that he did was the blur analysis. Alvarez knew that a loud noise like a gunshot was going to startle anybody that was in Dealey Plaza that heard it, including Zapruder. And that startle reaction, which is called the Morrow reflex, would have caused him to jiggle the camera, and the angular acceleration to the camera body would be detectable in the film. Well, the largest angular acceleration to the camera body happens to be at frame 313, the instant that President Kennedy was shot, was struck by the bullet, and that's a problem. This is the two scenarios. This is if the shot came from the book depository. If you have an impact here between frame 313 and 312, because he's already been struck here at 313 and he wasn't struck at 312, so we placed the shot here in between 312 and 313. The actual trigger time for a man like a Carcano, 2160 feet per second, means the bullet would have been fired here, and since the bullet travels twice the speed of sound, the sound is not going to arrive until here. The earliest that Zapruder could have reacted is at frame 315. Okay, Alvarez knew that. Alvarez knew that the movement is too late. So Alvarez in his paper says, well, then it must have been the shock wave of the bullet that caused the camera body to move. Okay, now I have my doubts that the shock wave from the bullet fired at President Kennedy could have moved that camera body. But Alvarez did not do his homework. He did not show us the work, because if you do the calculation for when the shock wave arrives, the shock wave still arrives too late. It doesn't arrive until after frame 313. So it couldn't have been. So, and I'm sure that Alvarez knew this. The other calculation I'm sure he did, which he didn't show, was let's do it now for the grassy knoll. Okay? Here's where the impact is again. Now, this President was only 100 feet from the place on the grassy knoll where the acoustics places the shot, and only 50 feet away from Zapruder, so assuming a rifle like a 30-30 where the speed of the bullet's twice the speed of sound, they would have arrived exactly coincident during frame 313, and that would cause Zapruder to react. Actually, before the frame, there's a slight latency before a person actually reacts. But so the movement of the camera body at frame 313 is coordinate with it being a Morrow reflex, a startle reaction from a gunshot from the grassy knoll. Well, this is the guy that decides going to review the acoustical evidence. Okay, next slide. They couldn't find any problems with the core acoustical evidence, but what they found was a case of crosstalk, a voice that was signaled that was actually on both channels. Ironically, it came from Sheriff Decker, and it was an order to his men at the sheriff's station to surround the grassy knoll and hold everything secure until we can get homicide people in there. The problem is that this broadcast was not put out on Channel 2 until about 80 seconds after the assassination. But on Channel 1, it's virtually synchronous with the actual gunfire. Next slide. Okay, this is a synchronization of the two tapes. That would be compelling evidence that the gunshots cannot be synchronous with the gunfire, the actual assassination, therefore can't be the gunshots. But the problem was that it was not the only instance of crosstalk. There were 5 separate instances of crosstalk, vocalizations that are actually on both channels, and none of them synchronize with one another. They're all separated by different intervals of time on the two channels. Ergo, something has happened, something, either the timeline on the recordings is broken, this is not continuous real time, or something else has caused a displacement of those broadcasts, and we've never figured out what it was. But in any case, that means that you cannot, because of those displacements, those offsets, you cannot use the crosstalks to prove a lack of synchronization. And of course they knew this. So my plan was to play for you this sequence and then play for you this sequence here. Maybe after I get done talking we can do that. Go ahead and let's go to the next slide. Okay, if I could play it for you, what you would hear is you would hear the first instance of crosstalk. This is a police officer, actually the deputy chief of police, Fisher, who said the words, "I'll check it." Right after which, 2 seconds later, there's a series of snap, crackle, pop. These are the sounds that the acoustical experts identified as the gunfire. And immediately after the last shot is when you hear Sheriff Decker say, you know, hold everything secure, you know, lock up that grassy knoll area. Okay, next slide. Over on channel 2, which is the motorcade channel, you hear these are the key broadcasts. One of the most important, of course, is where the chief of police, Curry, who was in the lead car of the motorcade, realized the president had been shot and starts shouting into his microphone, okay, go to the hospital, officers, Parkland Hospital, go to the hospital. 20 seconds before that is where Chief Curry said, I'm at the triple underpass. Throughout this recording, he was announcing his location as he went through Dallas. Okay. Yeah, this is my last slide. This is the broadcast which is actually closest to the time of the shooting. Just 2 seconds before that is when Deputy Chief Fisher said the words, "I'll check it." Just 2 seconds before this marker. Next slide. This is a picture of the motorcade in Dealey Plaza. Here's the limousine. That's the lead car. That's where Curry was and Decker was, who just made those broadcasts. He's about 150 feet ahead of the limousine. Next slide. And so if he's here, he's approaching or at the triple underpass, and the limousine's about 150 behind him, he's right in the kill zone. That's why we say that's the marker. When he says, I'm at the triple underpass, or approaching the triple underpass, that's your key marker to the time closest to the actual time of the assassination. Just 2 seconds before that, Chief Fisher, Deputy Chief Fisher said the words, "I'll check it." And so on both channels, that Fisher crosstalk is 2 seconds before the actual assassination, and it's 2 seconds before the sounds identified as gunshots. So the crosstalk actually shows precise coordination, synchronization between the sounds allegedly as gunshots and the actual time of the assassination. Next slide. Okay. Well, I guess I should cut it off. That's okay. All right. I was almost finished anyway. Thank you.
We can, thank you, Don. I'm going to let Don, have some Q&A on this, but we are going to, at this point, abandon this room where we cannot get any Wi-Fi connection and go back to the Lawrence where we can so that we can see all our remote speakers. So we're going to do the rest of the conference from here out inside the Hotel Lawrence in the back of the second floor, and a slightly smaller room, but I think we'll all fit into it. But this we'll have none of the remote speakers in here. We cannot get Wi-Fi access in here. So I'm going to go back over there now. Peter Dale Scott asked me to read you part of his talk, which I'll do. We can follow immediately over there with some questions to him, and then I'll do that part, and then we're going to, I think around 11, try to get the next speaker coming in through the Wi-Fi. So thanks. And we're going to do Q&A over there. Yeah, just go over there now.
Where for military sonar, submarines don't have windows because they can navigate by sonar. These guys are the ones who actually wrote the software for those computers. They not only reviewed the evidence, but they actually advanced the study further. But they were only paid to really look at the grassy knoll shot because that was the one that was really controversial.
Okay.
Now, I mentioned in the talk that there were 5 shots. And those of you who read the House Select Committee report, they say 4. If you go back the acoustical report and look at their data tables, and you see that there's 5. And in that report, it said the reason why they dismissed that 5th shot is because they said it was too close to the earlier shot to have been fired by the Miller rifle, which required 2.3 seconds to recycle. I talked to James Barger, the lead scientist, about this, and I said, that's essentially saying if Oswald didn't shoot it, it's not a gunshot. And he admitted, yeah, that criteria was ad hoc, which is Latin for bullshit. I also talked to Robert Blakey, the head of the chief counsel, and he told me that basically he felt that he could not go to the committee with 5-shot scenario. That if he had 3 shots from the book depository, 1 from the grassy knoll, he could sell that. So they swept the 5th shot under the rug. And the problem is that when you do that, when you corrupt your evidence, obviously you're not going to have a good synchronization between the video, for example, and the audio, and these other pieces of evidence that you actually need to see if this is a true set of evidence or not. So that's how that happened. But anyway, to answer your question, okay, 5 shots. The only one that they pinpointed was by the second group, using the sonar principles, was the grassy knoll shot. So they could pinpoint 10 feet from the corner of the fence. By process elimination, you would assume there were 3 shots from the book depository, and that would have been the 1st, the 3rd, and the 5th. And then there's a rogue shot that fits in between the 1st and 3rd. That's the 2nd shot. Where it comes from, since nobody's actually applied this sonar analysis to it, the best we can say is that it would fit coming from the direction of the intersection more than it would, for example, from the other direction. We can't rule that out, but right now you would say it probably came from the direction of the intersection.
Can you match these up to Zapruder film frame numbers, like say shot?
Oh, okay. The first shot is at frame 175. The second shot fits in at about 202.
Okay.
The third fits at 224.
The third one's 224?
224. The fourth one's 313.
313 headshot.
And the fifth one's 326.
Me what?
326?
So a shot occurred after Kenny was killed.
Right.
And the Connolly shot would be 224?
Right.
Is your book going to be out there?
I brought some copies, and I'll put them there. I just got a few, so hopefully, and I haven't met the fellow in the resource room. I assume you'll let me put them in there?
What about the Tay shots? The shot that almost hit JFK?
Right. It was the first or the second, probably the first one is the one that missed, because the witnesses in the book depository who were standing in front of the book depository said they saw the bullet hit the street right to the right behind the limousine. So it was probably that first one. Could have been the second one, but that was the one that missed and sprayed up and hit the hit tag. Okay. Okay. Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because I mean, read my book, but for the purpose of save time, on the acoustical evidence there is another loud sound that precedes the first one that they decided was a gunshot by about a second. Now that one, they actually tested different ways. They thought the problem with it was that it was not as loud as the other ones. It was more of a muffled sound. So one of the ideas they had was maybe it's a pistol shot. So not a lot of people heard a loud sound, which he thought was a motorcycle backfire, and it came from down below and to the left. He said the second sound was the one that just reverberated and shook the dirt off the ceiling, and he said there was no doubt then that's a gunshot, and that was probably the first shot from the actual gunshot. And so there was an earlier sound there, which is on the police tape, and in fact it looks like that's the one that Conley responded to, because remember Conley did a switch and did a turnaround, did a quick double take. It's coordinate with that movement. So I'm suspecting that there probably really was, like the witnesses said, one of the motorcycles backfired. And I've always wondered, wow, maybe that actually triggered people. If you get a triangulation, that people thought, whoa, they started shooting, I better start shooting. Something like that. Of course, now we're really into real speculation. But there is a sound on the police tape.
Were the 5 shots replicated in 1978 shot from the grassy knoll? 5 shots in 1978, right?
Okay, in '78, they fired test shots from the book depository and from the grassy knoll. And they had 36 microphones. So you multiply 36 times 2 locations, times 4 shots from each. They had 4 different targets lined up in the street. And I forget, about 300. It's about 400 some odd recordings, test recordings that they actually used to compare to the sounds that are on the police tape. Okay.
We got to cut it off and go to somebody else, but you can ask him questions.
They did monopolize.